Jeff Novitzky, UFC VP of Athlete Health and Performance. Thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
Thanks for having me, Amber.
Give me a bit of background about how many fighters you typically test in the UFC per year, how often you're doing it, and under normal circumstances, no coronavirus, and then how the coronavirus has impacted your ability to drug test athletes.
Yeah, our contract with the United States Anti-Doping Agency, which independently administers our program, calls for approximately 4,250 tests per year. And in light of these unusual circumstances here, you're probably not going to be seeing those types of numbers for the next couple of weeks, because the reality is anti-doping is dealing with the exact same situation that the world's dealing with. You're dealing with athletes or drug collection officers that could be quarantined. You're dealing with, human beings that have, a level of apprehension about potentially, interacting with a stranger. So I think you'll see those numbers during this period go down. Now, USADA has publicly stated that only mission critical testing will be ongoing. And while they always hold things very close to the vest and don't even, inform the UFC of their testing plans, I think what that's going to mean is they're taking a look at potential upcoming events and focusing their testing on those athletes that are participating in those events.
It sounds to me like this might be an opportune time for a fighter to cheat. What do you think about that?
Sure. I mean, that's always a concern, but, I think you have to put things in perspective. And while the UFC feels this way, I certainly feel this way, that anti-doping is very, very important in sport, and maybe no more sport than MMA and the UFC. Looking at it relatively to what's going on in the world, that level of importance on the totem pole is certainly not as high as the things that we're dealing with. Now, one advantage, and we've seen this over the last couple of years, is the sensitivity of testing at laboratories. And, we've had instances, very high profile ones, one involving John Jones, where a prohibited substance they've been able to detect it for years in his system without re-administration of that. So, for those athletes that think that this would be a loophole, to drive through, they're playing a risky game, because these laboratories can detect very, very, very small quantities for weeks, months, and sometimes years at a time.
You said that USADA does not tell you about its testing plans, but I'm wondering, UFC is such an international sport. With each country dealing with coronavirus differently, have you heard any stories about this lab is not open, it's been shut down in this country, we can't take the results here, or there are workers who refuse to go out and administer these tests?
Yeah, it is the case that several, if not all, of the international laboratories that we use are closed because of this coronavirus, but that would not prohibit USADA from going out and making the collections and then storing the samples, often in deep freeze. In fact, that is the case with our most recent event in Brazil. There were a number of collections done down there on fight night, but the laboratory was closed, so those samples would be stored in deep freeze for a period of time, and they can do that indefinitely. And then when the laboratories open back up again, they can test those samples.
Have you heard from any fighters that they're concerned that other fighters might take advantage of this time and try to use PEDs?
Not so much on that side. The concern that we've been hearing is just the general apprehensiveness that we're all feeling. We got a call earlier in this week, a fighter that, is quarantined at home by order of his country and has an elderly mother living with him. And so the concern was, hey, I'm all for clean sport and the USADA program, but I don't want a stranger coming into my house and exposing me potentially and my mom. What USADA has done and what they will do ongoing is they put a series of things into effect. The drug collection officers will wear, masks and gloves. They will maintain that 6 to 10 foot distance from the athlete. A lot of people haven't seen what the collection process looks like in the UFC and what USADA does, but the reality is the athlete or the drug collection officer never handles the sample. It's always the athlete handling the sample, and they do that to eliminate, the possible explanation from an athlete that their sample was tampered with. So the athlete's the one providing the sample. The athlete's the one locking the sample up. Obviously, it's done with a drug collection officer in close proximity to observe it, but there's actually no handling of it. So what that would allow in a time like this is a drug collection officer could observe the entire thing within 6 to 10 feet and protect both the DCO and the athlete.
The fighter you mentioned that was concerned about the health of his mother, what did you end up deciding in that case to do?
We passed that information along to USADA and basically told the fighter, look, we can't guarantee that someone is not going to show up and test, but if they do and you have concerns, get on the phone with me and we'll talk through this and try to come up, with a solution.
How does this upcoming card, UFC 249, how is it impacted?
Yeah, in terms of, our program, we've been in, constant communication with USADA. As soon as we have a card that's finalized with those athletes on it, we will get those names immediately to USADA. And being that they're only right now instituting mission critical testing, I would expect that those fighters on that card would likely be tested in the run up to the fight. And then there will be, a collection of drug collection officers at the event itself to do in-competition testing.
It's neat on your Twitter going through it to see all the well-known UFC stars that are so proud of having reached that 50 clean drug test mark, and they get those neat jackets. That being said, though, how real is doping within the UFC, within MMA still?
Yeah, I'm not naive, and I will never say, well, I believe this is the most comprehensive program in professional sports in the world. I will never say that doping's been eradicated, completely. You always have to assume that there's, a new drug out there that's not detectable or new techniques on how you use these drugs to limit that detection. So, it's an ongoing, cat and mouse game that I don't think is ever going to end. However, when you look at the details of what this program entails and the true independence factor of the entity that's administrating it, USADA, they don't have any business interests. They could care less about, a fighter that's suspended and what that means revenue-wise to the UFC. That true unpredictability of testing where not even the UFC knows when USADA is going to conduct a test. That's how you conduct a world-class anti-doping program. So, I feel we have the strongest in the world. And I also feel that, there's no more sport on the planet that deserves the strongest anti-doping program in the world because this is true strength on strength, stamina on stamina, and it's the most skilled martial artist on the planet. And so when you think about what an already skilled martial artist could do if they're artificially enhanced, it's very worrisome.
From my own knowledge, since USADA is U.S. based, when you test a fighter in a different country, how do you go about getting someone to that location?
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons why we chose USADA to administer this program. They have partners and close relationships with anti-doping organizations all over the world. So, if a fighter is in the hills of Russia, USADA can pick the phone up and call a trusted ally in that area of the country and do that collection. And so that's something that we've shown over these last 5 years. It doesn't matter what country you're from, where you live, how remote an area that you live in, USADA can come out and collect those samples from those athletes.
In doing a little bit of research ahead of this interview, I came across an article in which Conor McGregor was talking about Jose Aldo in Brazil and said because the culture there is more PED prone or accepting of it, maybe he would get a pass when he's getting tested because he's getting someone in his own home country coming to him. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think the proof's in the pudding. There's been several Brazilian athletes that their samples were collected in Brazil that have tested positive under this program. And so I wouldn't expect anything, otherwise. In relation to Jose Aldo, he is going to be our third athlete, and we were planning to do it in a month or two, but that may be postponed now. But he's our third athlete to achieve a 50 perfect test history. So very proud of him for that. And I think what that does, and the reason that we have this program in effect to recognize these fighters, is it puts kind of a stamp of approval on a career. So when you look at his career and the great things he's done, and now he can say, look, over this 5-year period, I was tested unannounced 50 times, night, day, in the middle of the day. Look, I have a high level of confidence when you're talking about those numbers and unannounced testing that you're looking at a clean athlete.
Thank you. And then is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to make sure fighters out there watching know?
The biggest one is, and we've talked with many fighters around the world, but we're always available if fighters have concerns about drug collecting officers showing up at their house. They all have my number. I'm available 24/7, and in fact, I do. I take calls at all hours of the day, all days of the week, and that's part of my job is talking those fighters through, when they're concerned. Or as things come up. So, that's what my job is and always available.
Jeff Novitzky, UFC VP of Athlete Health and Performance, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Amber.